from the outside, most wealth managers look the same. Underneath the surface, the difference is enormous. The right wealth manager can massively increase the probability of you building your wealth over decades, but the wrong wealth manager will cost you time, efficiency, tax leakage, and missed opportunities. I'm Dan Thompson. I'm a chartered wealth manager and multi-business founder. And over the last 15 years, I have had this question asked of me time and time again from potential prospects that are considering coming on board, from business partners, from friends, from other founders, high-level executives. The list quite literally goes on. They all ask the same question, Dan, what should I look for in a wealth manager? How do I choose a wealth manager? And it's a really fair question, because from the outside, most wealth managers, most advisors look the same. And it doesn't help matters that the words used to describe an advisor or wealth manager are often used interchangeably. You have financial advisor, financial planner, wealth manager, asset manager, and all those roles are slightly different. And also there's a big difference between financial advisors, certain financial advisors and certain wealth managers, because they all talk about long-term investing. They all talk about diversification. They all talk about financial planning, right? And underneath the surface, the difference is enormous between some wealth managers. And those differences will compound massively over time, because the right wealth manager can massively increase the probability of you growing, building your wealth and protecting it over decades. But the wrong wealth manager won't necessarily destroy things overnight, but what they will do is cost you time, efficiency, tax leakage, poor structure, and potentially missed opportunities. And that all adds up, especially over time. So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what to look for in a good wealth manager, calmly, objectively, structurally, so you can make that decision properly. So first off, qualifications. So in the UK, the level 4 qualification is the minimum to give financial advice. This is the baseline. This is the entry requirement. This is literally the legal minimum. And serious advisors who are worth their salt go beyond that minimum, in my opinion. Ideally, you want someone who's chartered, because chartered requires advanced examinations, ongoing professional development, higher ethical standards, and peer-reviewed competence. That's probably the best way to describe it. It demonstrates a longer term commitment to the profession, but also to your clients. In my opinion, if someone is advising you on your life's capital, your life's work, regulated just doesn't cut it. It's not enough. So you should look to elevate your standards as a good wealth manager. And maybe, I'm a little bit biased because I have been chartered as a wealth manager for well over a decade now, since my 20s. So the next one is specialization. Do they understand people like you? Because this is massively overlooked with clients when they're selecting a good wealth manager or choosing a wealth manager, because wealth planning is highly contextual. Because a wealth manager who primarily works with retirees will think differently than one that works with founders. And a wealth manager that, say, specializes in NHS doctors will structure things differently than one that works with business owners. So what you've got to do is you've got to ask yourself, is the wealth manager I'm dealing with or thinking of working with used to dealing with people in my industry? Are they used to understanding people who have my tax position or in my tax position? Have they advised people at my stage of life? Are they used to dealing with people on my level, with my level of net worth? Do they understand things like liquidity events, business exits, share schemes? Do they understand, if relevant, cross-border issues and international financial planning? The only way I can kind of really explain this is a 28-year-old founder, as an example, has very, very different challenges when it comes to financial advice, wealth planning, than a 55-year-old executive. A high-growth entrepreneur has different risks than a salaried employee. So advisors, naturally, they think in patterns. And if you don't fit the pattern that a wealth manager is typically used to, you're going to end up with generic advice. And you do not want generic, you want aligned. So the next thing I'd look for in a good wealth manager is one that has wider knowledge, or what I would call a multidisciplinary advisor or wealth manager, because qualifications when it comes to wealth management are the absolute flaw, in my opinion. What you want is an advisor who has broader intellectual depth, because wealth management intersects with loads of other areas. So tax structuring, estate planning, corporate restructuring, private equity, venture capital, behavioral finance, debt facilities, international tax regimes, or cross-border advice, if relevant, of course. And does the wealth manager understand how these pieces connect together, because it's a little bit like a puzzle. You don't need them necessarily to be a tax specialist or a private equity specialist, but you do need them to be able to think systematically, because the best wealth managers I've ever met can see the bigger picture. What they can do is connect income, tax, structure, risk, liquidity, estate planning, and legacy. And if your advisor only talks about funds and performance, that is incomplete advice. Wealth is so much bigger than asset allocation. And my advice would be find a multidisciplinary advisor that can connect all the dots. So my next bit of advice is, what is your wealth manager's network like? Who is in their circle? Because serious wealth managers, they don't operate alone. What they do is they have a professional ecosystem. Is probably the best way to describe it, because what you want to do is you want to ask your wealth manager, or ask a wealth manager when you're choosing them, what is their access to good accountants, to tax specialists? Do they collaborate with good corporate solicitors or lawyers even? Do they have good private banking relationships? Do they have access to wider investment solutions, more bespoke arrangements, things like VCTs, EISs, maybe advisory and discretionary portfolios, maybe access to private equity? Do they understand lending? Do they understand structured finance? Do they have international contacts, if relevant? And can they facilitate cross-border advice, again, if relevant? Because as wealth grows, complexity naturally grows. An advisor with a strong professional network can massively leverage your situation. However, an advisor without one becomes a serious bottleneck when it comes to building and scaling and protecting wealth. So serious wealth is never built in isolation. A great wealth manager will build a professional team around you. So when it comes to choosing a wealth manager, you're not just choosing an individual, because what you're also doing is choosing the infrastructure that is behind that individual, because you need to understand who regulates the firm behind the wealth manager. What compliance framework exists, what oversight is there behind the wealth manager, how robust is the infrastructure, because strong firms have things like investment committees, large investment teams, due diligence processes, strong governance oversight, good internal research, and clear advice frameworks for their wealth managers. And weak firms purely rely on the individual. This creates key man risk to you as a potential client, as an investor. And if the advisor leaves, retires, underperforms, the question I would ask is, what actually remains? You're not just choosing a person. When it comes to picking a good wealth manager, you're choosing also the ecosystem behind that person. So this next one isn't about ego, it's about capability and experience, because advisors who manage a significant amount of funds under management or assets under management, basically the amount of money the wealth manager looks after or is responsible for, often have stronger operational systems, processes, and depth. They have navigated multiple market cycles over their career. They have access to better resources, larger teams, and have experienced more complex scenarios typically. And scale brings pattern recognition to good wealth managers, but there is a nuance, because you want someone who is big enough to be experienced but small enough to actually care. Because if you met a wealth manager who was advising 5 million in funds under management, they may, I'm not saying all of them, but of course there's a high probability they may lack depth. However, if you came across a good wealth manager that's managing 5 billion, personally, they may not have time for you. There is a balance when it comes to finding a good wealth manager. And one thing to ask is the amount of money they have under management, that they're personally responsible for managing, and how they manage that amount of funds under management, because they may have built significant teams to deal with larger funds under management, but they also may have not. And I can only speak from my own personal experience. As I built my own wealth management firm and scaled past 100 million in funds under management, I had to naturally bring in more and more people to help manage my clients, provide better levels of service, and make sure quality wasn't diluted. And that is key to having a good wealth manager. So the next one is critical. You want a solid team behind the wealth manager you're dealing with. You do not want advisors that are operating alone, because they'll be doing everything: advice, admin, power planning, research, compliance, client servicing. That is not scalable. That is fragile and will naturally lead to mistakes. Strong advisors have power planners, they have an admin team, they have junior wealth managers, they have an investment team, they have compliance oversight, they have a research team. This naturally means you're going to have a better level of service, you're going to have faster execution, fewer mistakes, a more proactive service. You're going to have greater availability from your wealth manager. And you don't just want a good advisor. What you want is a good wealth manager that has a strong team behind him, not a stressed individual that's trying to juggle everything themselves. So this one is where you separate process from personality. So when you're potentially choosing or selecting a wealth manager, what I would be keen to understand is what is their investment philosophy? What is it they actually believe in? Because any advisor can talk about long-term investing, right? But that is not good enough. You need to understand the actual philosophy behind your wealth manager, and that will separate the average wealth managers from the great, because you will understand their technical expertise, their technical knowledge behind the scenes. Are they technically competent, or are they more just like a relationship manager? And I would ask them directly, some tough questions like, how do they rebalance portfolios? How are portfolios constructed? How do they manage downside risk? How do they define and actually measure risk? How often do they rebalance portfolios, and why? What specifically happened to their client portfolios during major market downturns like the pandemic or the financial crisis? Or more recently, what changed in 2022? The answers, to be clear, should not be vague, and they certainly should not be defensive. So good advisors have a documented investment philosophy. They have a repeatable process. They have clear risk parameters. They have a defined rebalancing discipline and behavior that remains changed even when there's market volatility, because markets will fall without a doubt, and if any advisor tells you anything different, they're not being honest with you, because it's not a possibility, it's a certainty they will drop back at some point. And the real question is, what does your advisor or wealth manager do when the market's correct, when they drop back? Do they chase performance? Do they panic? Do they suddenly change strategy? Or do they execute a predefined process? So just to be clear, wealth is not built through prediction. I don't care what anyone says, no one can predict markets. It's built through discipline, through consistency, through resisting the urge to be clever. And the philosophy should be clear enough that you can understand it as a client, as an investor, but robust enough that it doesn't change every time the markets drop back or headlines do. If the investment approach feels improvised by your advisor, by your wealth manager, it probably is. And improvised investing rarely compounds well. So the next one is where most relationships fail. What happens next after you sign? The first meeting is polished, the onboarding is smooth, the plan looks impressive, that's been put in place. But what happens in year 2? What happens in year 5? What happens in year 10? Because this is what matters, because real wealth management isn't about setting a plan and forgetting about it. Set and forget. It's about maintaining, refining, being proactive and protecting wealth over decades. So what I would ask is some key questions when selecting or choosing a wealth manager. So how often do they formally review portfolios or client accounts? What triggers an additional review? Do they coordinate with tax advisors, accountants, solicitors? Can you contact them anytime, or is there boundaries around contact? Is full financial modeling included? Cash flow forecasting? Do they proactively review tax allowances? Do they track performance against goals, against benchmarks? What benchmarks are those? Or are they tracking against certain market indices? What is included in your ongoing advice fee and what isn't included in it? And get really clear on that, because clarity here is what prevents resentment longer term. So you shouldn't have to chase your wealth manager to review something important. Your wealth manager should be proactive. And don't get me wrong, they can't understand or predict what's going on in your life. So you do have to keep them in the loop. You have a responsibility at your end. But generally speaking, their advice, their service should be proactive and not reactive, because strategic wealth management means regular cadences when it comes to reviews, clear ownership, defined responsibilities, forward planning when it comes to your finances. If the service model isn't clearly articulated, there probably isn't one. Structure is what compounds. Silence, sadly, will erode trust in the relationship. So my final point, and this is a point that most people underestimate, is that yes, qualifications matter, processes matter, structure and systems matter, but alignment with the wealth manager you're working with matters more than any of it, because you're not hiring someone for a transaction. You are entering into a relationship that may last 10, 20, 30 years. And that means you need more than just competence from your wealth manager. So you need to feel that your wealth manager understands you and how you think. They understand your risk tolerance, not just on paper, but emotionally. They are not sales driven. They are calm. They are collective. They are prioritizing long-term outcomes for you, because a good wealth manager should feel steady. They should feel rational. They should feel measured. They should not be reactive. And you, as a client, as an investor, should never feel pressured, should never feel rushed, should never feel confused, and you certainly should never feel sold to. If you walk out of the meeting and you are confused, you're overwhelmed, you're unclear, that is not sophistication on the wealth manager's part. That's misalignment. They have let you down. And the best advisors will simplify complexity when it comes to investments. They will reduce anxiety. They will bring order to the journey, to the relationship. And perhaps most importantly, they will think in decades as opposed to quarters. So the bottom line is raise your standard. When you're choosing a good wealth manager, choose wisely. A good wealth manager will not overcomplicate things. They will simplify complexity. They will make things clear and easy to understand. They will structure things intelligently. They will optimize tax. They will protect downside risk and know how to manage it. They will coordinate with professionals and build a team around you. And most importantly, they will think long term. They will think in decades. They will certainly not sell hype or overtrade or overcomplicate things or overpromise. And they certainly shouldn't rush you or pressure you or sell to you, because when you're choosing someone essentially to steward what will be decades of your life's work, the standard should be exceptionally high when you're choosing a good wealth manager, because wealth management is more than just chasing returns. It is so much more than that. It's about increasing the probability of your success over decades, and that is something you will never get by dumping your money in the S&P 500. So when you are choosing someone to work with or how to invest your money, choose wisely.